Assalamualaikum students, I hope you all are well, safe and healthy at home. Well, dear students, welcome to all of you in this class of literary studies. In previous class, you were taught about the Restoration Age, the important characteristics of Restoration Age, and the important literary figures and their work. And in today's class, we are going to talk about the literature of 18th century. Here we will discuss about the time duration of this age. We will talk about the important literary figures and important work. So let's start. When we talk about the literature of 18th century, the division which has been made by the historian, basically the historian called that the 18th century is the age of enlightenment. It is also called the age of sensibility, neoclassical age, Augustan age, and the long 18th century. So 18th century in England is called the classical age or the Augustan age in literature. It is also called the age of good sense or the age of reason. Although you were previously taught in the previous lecture that in the Restoration time, John Dryden was the prominent figure of literature, and he basically belonged to the 17th century. He is also included in the classical or Augustan age, as during his time, the characteristics of his age had influence later on even in the 18th century. So this age is called the age of enlightenment because from the Restoration age, the awareness, the enlightenment started, which continued even in the 18th century. It is called the classical age in English literature or neoclassical age in English literature on account of three reasons. In the first place, the term classic refers to genre applies to writers of the highest rank in any nation. This term was first applied to the works of Greek and Roman writers, as the writers of the 18th century in England tried to follow the simple and noble methods of the great Greek ancient writers, so they begin to called classical writers. In the second place, in every national literature, there is a period when a large number of writers produce works of great merit. Such a period is often called the classical period. So this age is called the neoclassical age or the long 18th century. 18th century is also called the age of reason or the age of good sense because people thought that they could stand on their own legs and be guided in the conduct of their affairs by the light of their own reason, unclouded by the respect for ancient precedent. That's why it is also called the age of reason. When we talk about the major events of 18th century, so let me tell you that there were three major events that took place in the 18th century. These are as follows: the American Revolution. American Revolution came in 18th century in England, and French Revolution also came in 18th century. Along with this, the third important event of 18th century is the Industrial Revolution. On the basis of the Industrial Revolution, this age is called the Age of Enlightenment. When we talk about the society and culture, from the religious point of view, in the 18th century, not many people went to church, and religion was not a big thing. There was no importance given to religion in the 18th century, specifically in the start of the 18th century. So most people went to church on a Sunday. However, there was a lack of energy in the church. This changed in 1730s. A man called George Whitefield became a great preacher, and the Church of England became the main place where the people went. So by the end of 18th century, religious enthusiasm begin to revive in the 18th century. But in the start of the 18th century, there was no much interest of the people in religion. From an educational point of view, in the early 18th century, charity schools were founded in many towns. They were sometimes called the Blue Coat schools because of the color of the children's uniforms. The charity schools, which were founded in the start of the 18th century, so mostly people sent their children to the charity schools, and those schools were called the Blue Coat schools because the uniform of the students were blue. That's why the schools were called the Blue Coat schools. Boys from well-off families went to grammar schools. Girls from well-off families also went to school, but it was felt important for them to learn accomplishments like embroidery, music, rather than academic subjects. At that time, girls were going to the schools, but it was a concept, it was from cultural point of view that the focus was given on developing and learning the techniques like embroidery, music, etc. So the focus on studying the major subjects were not popular for females. So however, nonconformists were not allowed to attend most public schools. Instead, they went to their own dissenting academies. Nonconformists were those people who were Protestants, who did not belong to the Church of England, because at that time in England there were two classes, Catholics and Protestants. When we talk about education, culture, religion at that time, it is very important to understand the politics of 18th century, because all these has greater impact on the literature of that particular time. So in the 18th century, there was a destruction of political countries, political centuries that had been built from the past centuries, because in the past century there was monarchy. After one king left, and after that next king came. So the political parties lost their power and were taken over. During the 18th century, the political parties lost their power. So by the middle of 18th century, both Whigs and Tories found themselves changed from what they had been. Right? So Whigs and Tories were two parties of the parliament, which were there even in the time of the Puritan age. So by the middle of 18th century, both the parties found themselves changed from what they had been. And this change has been noticed even in the work, literary work. As I already told you, literature is the depiction of the society. So culture, politics, education, age, and every aspect had been depicted in the literature of that particular age. Now let us consider the important literary characteristics of the 18th century. In the previous ages which we have dealt with, it were the poetical works which were given prominence. Now for the first time in the history of English literature, prose occupies the prominent and front position. So as in the political part, you were told that it was the age of social and political and religious literary controversies, because there was conflict among the Tories and the Whigs. So a large number of journals and magazines were brought out in order to cater the growing needs of the masses who had begun to read and take interest in these controversial matters. So poetry was considered inadequate for such tasks, and hence there was a rapid development of prose. So in fact, the prose writer of that age excelled the poets in every respect. So it was the time when prose became very popular and very important. So two main characteristics of this restoration period were realism and precision. So these two important characteristics were carried to further perfection during the 18th century. They are found in their excellent form in the poetry of Pope, who perfected the heroic couplet, and in the prose of Addison, who developed into a clear, precise, and elegant form of expression. Along with this, the other important literary characteristics of the 18th century age is the development of satire. As I already told you that it was the age of the political conflict and controversies. So this nature, this aspect of the society was depicted in the literature and resulted in the development of satire. And it was the time of the origin and development of the novel. In the 18th century, the novel developed and originated. So these are the important characteristics of the age of 18th century. If we look deeply, so according to the grammarian and according to the historians, 18th century has been divided into three classes, into three periods: the age of Dryden, age of Pope, and the age of Johnson. Previously, in the previous class, you were taught about the Restoration age, which is also called the age of Dryden, because Dryden was the important literary figure of the Restoration age. So the age of Pope, it starts from 17th century to 1750, and the age of Johnson, which starts from 1740 to 18th century. These are the two ages of the 18th century, which we will discuss in today's class. So the two important periods of the 18th century, the age of Pope and Swift. This period is also called the age of Pope and Swift because Jonathan Swift was the important literary figure of that age. So having neoclassical style characterized by Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift has written the novel. Along with this, he is the master of prose. The second period is characterized by Johnson, the work of Johnson, which is called the age of Johnson. So it was the beginning of a shift toward the Romanticism. Keep one point in your mind that the end of 18th century was the start of the Romanticism. This is a movement, and after the 18th century, in England, there came a Romantic age. So Johnson was the important literary figures who played very important role in beginning the shift toward the Romanticism. So, and Daniel Defoe is one of the important literary figures of 18th century. He was born into a working class family and he was considered the ministry, but instead decided on becoming a crafty businessman. He didn't start writing the novels that made him famous until into his 60s. Daniel Defoe wrote two very important novels. A new form at that time in the 18th century, as I already told you that it was the age of the beginning and the development of the novel. So Daniel Defoe played very important role in the development of the novel. He has written two important novels. One was Robinson Crusoe and the other was Moll Flanders. Both were basically the non-fiction novels. Crusoe started a genre of novel because Robinson Crusoe is considered the first novel. And he also wrote a real non-fiction account, Journal of the Plague Year. The other important literary figures along with Pope and Johnson, Jonathan Swift was also an important literary figure of this age. He was born in Dublin, Ireland. He was a minister in the Church of England. His satirical works ruined his chances to advance in the church because he was an important figure in the church, but he has written a satirical work against the church. That's why it became a major reason that he couldn't gain a prominent position in the church. So still he remained a staunch supporter of the Anglican faith. He held a great amount of political power in the later years and wrote political pamphlets for the government. He played a very important role in the development of the novel. He is one of the important prose writers of his age. His most important work of 18th century is Gulliver's Travels. He has written Gulliver's Travels, in which he has attacked the politics, church, and the whole society of 18th century. So Gulliver's Travels is considered one of the greatest satires in British literature. So satire, development of style is one of the important characteristics of the 18th century, and Jonathan Swift has played a very important role in this genre of literature. He depicted style in his Gulliver's Travels and in his other writings too. So when we talk about the satire, it is a work that blends humor and wit for the improvement of human institutions and humanity. Style is not intended to tear down as much as to inspire remodeling. It doesn't attack an individual, it will pass over a single foe to charge whole armies. So style is subtle enough that the reader must make the inference to what or who is being mocked or what or who is being attacked. So it's a type of attack. In other sense, you can say to taunt someone in a light and humorous way. So style is a style in which, in a humorous way, the other person is made target. Alexander Pope is an important literary figure of the 18th century. As I already told you, that the start of 18th century is called the Age of Pope. So he was the first English poet to support himself solely by his writing. He was a Catholic person, and physically he was very weak and slim person. His first major work was an essay on criticism, which brought him to attention of the leading literary figures of that age. It was his work, an essay on criticism, which gained a lot of popularity in the 18th century. So he was very weak and thin man. He was a brilliant satirist. One of his best known work is The Rape of Lock, one of the greatest mock epics in English. So he has developed the heroic couplets in the 18th century, and his Rape of the Lock work has been written in heroic couplets. Heroic couplets is basically iambic pentameter in rhymed pairs. It became a fixed word with Pope, Alexander Pope, and dominated English words for decades, and it was the time of the 18th century. So these all are the important aspects of the 18th century. In today's class, we specifically talked about the 18th century, how it started, and what is the division of the 18th century, and what are the important characteristics of the 18th century, and the important characteristics of the literature of 18th century. Well, as I already told you, that 18th century has been divided into three periods, into three ages, which are the age of Dryden, Pope, and Johnson. In today's lecture, you got an overview of the age of Pope and Johnson. Age of Dryden has already been discussed in the previous class. So in the next two lectures, you will be taught about the age of Pope in detail and the age of Johnson. So in the next class, we will discuss about the age of Pope, the important work of the Pope, and the important other literary figures of that particular age. So it was all about today's class. Here I'll wind up the session. In the next class, I'll come up with the division of the 18th century, that why the particular age is called the age of Pope, and what is the important literary work of Pope and other important literary figures. So till then, take care. Allah.